21. Leopold stood on a jetty, looking out over the dark lake. There were lights on the path over the far side set at ankle height, and they cast no light over the water itself. When Rodin called, the councillor turned and strode along the wooden platform, hand already outstretched.
Mr. Terrell. So glad you had no second thoughts, at least none that dissuaded you.
None at all. I'm always excited to gain new experiences.
Then shall we begin? Or do you need a moment? The clubhouse is still open.
The building was behind Rodin, the hum of chatter and muted thud of background music reaching down to the water. The glass doors previously open were closed now. Rodin had no wish to join the drinkers and merrymakers at the clubhouse, and even less of a desire to advertise his presence. I believe I'm ready. Is that your vessel? There was only one boat, dinghy, tied to the jetty, small and blue, bobbing lazily on the water. The mast stretched up higher than Rodin expected, but the mainsail was still folded and the jib was wrapped around the forestay. As it should be, from what Rodin had read.
That is my little extravagance, yes. Small but perfectly formed. Shall we?
Rodin expected the jetty to move more than it did. There was a gentle undulation, but nothing to upset his balance. Of course, once the boat was on the water, things would become more unstable. Leopold placed one foot in the dinghy, using his legs to pull it tight against the jetty, and Rodin stepped across. He sat, and breathed in time to the swaying of the vessel.
I have a spare vest, if you'd care to put it on.
Leopold stepped nimbly into the boat, and handed the garment to Rodin. It was thin, sleeveless, with fastenings at the front and a belt lower down. Rodin noticed now that Leopold wore something similar, although his was clearly crafted to look more like normal wear and less like a safety device. But Rodin knew it would work the same. If he went into the water, the vest would provide buoyancy. A complication, but not a reason to abandon the plan. Rodin would simply have to ensure that the man was far enough under, that the vest couldn't bring him to the surface. And if he happened to suffer an injury, as he went overboard.
Ready?
Leopold was already unfastening the sail, letting the canvas fall into the boat. Then he pulled on one of the ropes, the halyard if Rodin remembered correctly, and the sail began to rise. You set the boat without automation too? Rodin asked as he watched, noticing how confidently the councillor stepped even up on the gunwales.
Most definitely.
Leopold finished pulling, and the mainsail flapped in the wind, the boom swinging freely. Rodin shuffled, raising a hand to ward it off.
Maybe it's nothing more than a ritual, but I take pleasure in it.
Leopold pulled the rope sharply between a cleat, then stepped round the mast and began to unwind the jib from the forestay. The boat lurched from side to side, but he moved effortlessly.
But maybe I should give a commentary, as I work. That way you'll become more familiar with sailing, and Genevieve in particular.
Genevieve?
Every boat must have a name, and this girl is Genevieve. I had no say in the matter. Of course she was already named when I purchased her, and it's considered bad luck to change a vessel's given name. But it is a name that rolls round the mouth, is it not?
He leaned in slightly, a cue that he wanted Rodin's opinion. It's a nice name. That sounded weak. Almost sensual. Rodin had no idea where that came from, but it clearly pleased Leopold.
Absolutely. And then I researched the name. It's old, from before the chaos and the collapse.
He cleated the next rope and stood tall, one hand on the metal forestay, the canvas billowing off to the side.
And do you know what it means?
Rodin shrugged. I have no idea.
It means white wave.
Leopold reached forward, ran one hand up the mast.
White wave. Isn't that just perfect?
It does seem apt. Although, he thought, it could soon be the only white wave at the bottom of the lake. Stupid, naming an inanimate object.
Genevieve.
The man breathed, his face soft. Then he spun, jumped to the jetty.
But are we ready to sail? If you could grasp the tiller, my friend, that's the wooden pole in front of you. Hold it steady, that's it.
As he spoke, Leopold untied ropes, throwing one then the other onto the dinghy. The boat began to drift away, but Leopold bounded across and Rodin grasped the seat as the vessel rocked violently. Leopold smiled, sitting opposite Rodin and taking the tiller.
And we're off.
He reached down, pulling ropes. The sail puffed out and the boom swung round as the boat turned. They were sailing. It wasn't what Rodin expected. After a slight moment of nausea, the motion was gentle, the undulations peaceful. Water lapped against the boat and the sails flapped. At least until Leopold pulled the ropes tighter. Then the sail filled with air, the boat tilted and they picked up speed.
Ready about!
Leopold yelled and the boat lurched. Rodin was thrown forward, which was fortunate because the boom flew over his head. It felt like an invisible force had grabbed the boat and spun it around, before throwing it forward on a new course. And in that movement Leopold had swapped sides. He now sat beside Rodin, close enough to smell the soap the man had used, and the vaguely rubbery smell from his buoyancy vest.
My apologies,
the counselor said, his smile indicating how lacking in sorrow he really was.
I should have given you a few instructions. That was attack.
And he launched into a description of the way a sailing boat was turned. Rodin nodded in the right places, and asked a few questions, even though he knew many of the answers from his research. But things were always different off the screen, and he had not been expecting the suddenness of the tack. The next one was less jarring, and the one after that was almost pleasant. Rodin swapped sides now, keeping opposite Leopold. It didn't even bother him when the boat tilted, and Rodin was able to reach a hand into the water with ease. After another few minutes, he joined Leopold in slipping his feet under the webbing and leaning way over the edge of the boat, the tiny vessel listing madly as the counselor pulled the sail in tight. Rodin felt his heart rate increase as they skipped across the water, and the spray coated the smile on his face. Maybe there was more to sailing than he'd previously assumed. They jibed, a more violent maneuver that involved Leopold grasping the boom as it fought to fly across the boat. The turn was sharp, the ending sudden, and Rodin noted how Leopold kept his feet spaced wide, his center of gravity low. A move that could put a man off balance. An accident waiting to happen. Leopold talked as they sailed. He pointed out areas of the lake and of the park, at least, what could be seen. In the moonlight the water rippled, and that motion set it apart from the land. The paths were all illuminated by the same low-level lights, but other dots of illumination moved around. Torches, Leopold said, held by walkers. Not everyone was confident walking by the light of the moon. But there were no lights on the water itself, Rodin noted. No other vessels, and nobody to witness the upcoming catastrophe.
How are you faring, Terrell?
He asked.
Not queasy, are you?
No. I'm fine. There's so much to take in, so many facets of the experience to assimilate. I don't mean to be poor company.
Oh, but you're not. Far from it. My work often involves listening to others, so it's relaxing to be free to simply talk. My only fear is that I'll start boring you.
He laughed and Rodin smiled too.
But would you like to take the tiller?
Don't appear too eager. Are you sure? I'd be fearful of making a mistake. It seems incredibly complex. It didn't, of course. The sails caught the wind, and adjusting them altered the speed of the boat. The tiller moved the rudder, that plank of plastic sticking in the water at the back of the boat, and this was used for steering. Everything else was details and fancy names.
You'll be fine. One advantage of this time of night, we have the lake to ourselves.
But what of the sides, the bank? What if I crash?
Oh, no need to go anywhere near the edges. And if you do struggle, I can take over in an instant. There's nothing to be worried about.
If you think I'm up to it, of course I'll give it a go.
Excellent. I suggest the tiller in your left hand. Take the main sheet in your right. No, don't pull it yet. Keep the sail where it is. Aim for a nice straight line. That's it. Oh, this girl appreciates a firm hand. Don't worry, that was nothing but a gust. Let's try turning. Angle Genevieve into the wind. That's it. Feel how we're losing speed. Now turn sharp and make the move.
Ready about. Rodin cried out as he ducked under the slow-moving boom. The sail caught the wind from the opposite side, and they were off once more.
Excellent. And I'm impressed how you picked up on the correct call. I apologize, how often I forget. Now pull in the sail, just a fraction, let's build up a little speed.
Leopold kept up his commentary, as Rodin got the feel of the boat. It was frustrating how he never felt in total control. The wind wasn't steady, and it seemed that even moving about on the seat altered how the boat handled. But he soon had the hang of the basics. And he didn't realize he was smiling until Leopold commented on it. Rodin hadn't enjoyed himself this much for a long time.
Oh, you're a natural. That's excellent. But how about we try jibing?
Rodin slowed the dinghy, while Leopold explained the process, warning him how the wind would try to wrestle control of the sail, but that Rodin was Genevieve's master and he must keep a firm hand. Rodin stuttered a few responses and started the maneuver. He stood, mimicking Leopold's stance, but he allowed one leg to shake, and when he moved he did so in short jerks like he was panicking. He knew this was going to be awkward, but he didn't expect the wind to have so much force. His shoulder jarred as he fought to keep the boom where it was. Leopold shouted an instruction, something about pulling or pushing the tiller. Rodin pushed and the boat tilted high, water swimming around his legs. Leopold threw his weight over the side, feet under the straps and both hands on the gunwales. In the moonlight his face was as pale as the sail that bulged with wind. When Leopold yelled out wordlessly, Rodin let go of everything. The tiller slammed into his leg, and the boom flew over his head. The boat tilted again, and Leopold threw himself forward, practically pushing Rodin to one side. Then they were level, Rodin on a wet seat, Leopold opposite. "I'm sorry. That didn't go well."
Nonsense. It was tighter than might be advisable, but you turned us, and we didn't capsize. That's better than many do on their first attempt.
But there was a waver to his voice. For all his love of sailing, that move had unnerved Leopold. "Good.
Take the tiller back. Practice makes perfect, so maybe the wise thing would be for you to keep command. Let's try that maneuver again."
They did, and this time Rodin kept the boat from taking on water. It was still jerky. Maybe sailing wasn't as easy as it initially appeared.
Much better. It's difficult to believe you've never done this before. Oh, I'm most impressed, my friend.
Thank you. But it would take many, many hours of dedication to reach your easy mastery. The wind moved over the water, and in the moonlight Rodin saw ripples and peaks, some tight together, others spread out. He read the water, as he read situations and people. Ever-changing, but predictable to one who understood the signs. Rodin sailed the dinghy for a while longer, conscious of the subtle changes in the wind. He responded, teasing the tiller and the sail, making fractional movements, easing this Genevieve across the lake. Leopold continued talking, something about a committee he was a part of. Rodin nodded, made positive noises when it seemed appropriate, but his mind was on other things. He noted the coils and bends of ropes at his feet, and he nudged one, forcing it to flip over, forming a loop. He saw Leopold's leg so close to the rope. It wasn't so much a plan, as a way of taking advantage of the situation. If a jibe went wrong, Leopold would again rush about as he tried to keep his boat level. Rodin could, he believed, slip the loop of rope around the man's ankle in the confusion. But that might not be enough. If the boom came over suddenly, striking the counselor hard enough to knock him overboard. There were options here. Rodin simply had to do whatever it took to ensure the man stayed under the surface once he entered the water. The wind picked up and spray flew. Rodin's vest kept him warm though, and that set his mind on other thoughts. Leopold wore his vest with the release webbing hanging to one side. That might be a design flaw, but Rodin could take advantage of it. Rodin watched the water. He brought the boat round, keeping to the middle of the lake, away from land. He concentrated, breathing steadily, preparing his muscles. A patch of water rippled with white caps as a squall rushed over it. And the boat was in the perfect position. "Ready about," Rodin yelled, starting a slow turn into the wind. Leopold eased forward, ready to swap sides. Ready for Rodin to pull the tiller. But as the rush of wind hit, Rodin pushed instead, forcing the boat into a jibe. With a flick of his wrist he freed the sail, catching as much of the squall as possible. The boat creaked as it listed, building speed with the power of the wind. Rodin gripped the tiller, keeping the boat on the turn even when water started washing over the sides. Leopold yelled off balance, tricked by the movement. Rodin ducked as the wind grabbed the sail, sending the boom screaming over his head. He threw himself forward at the same time, one hand dipping to the water-logged deck, the other reaching for Leopold's vest. He pulled the webbing, freeing it, and before Leopold could respond he pushed. Leopold flew back as the boom crashed into him. Rodin dove to the water-filled bottom of the boat, throwing the loop of the rope round the counselor's flailing legs, pulling it tight. The whirl tilted violently, and they slammed into the water. In the icy blackness, Rodin grabbed Leopold, pulled him close. He punched, fist sinking into the man's stomach, and a rush of bubbles hit Rodin's face. Leopold slapped his arms wildly and Rodin spun him, grabbed rope and twisted it round the man's body. The counselor jerked and a hand clawed at Rodin's face. He knocked it away, pushing Leopold down even as his own vest pulled him to the surface. With one hand he released the webbing, shrugged it off his shoulders, let it float to the surface. And something hit him. Not the counselor but something solid, and there was movement all around, pushing against him. The sail. The boat must have turned upside down, and now the mast was pointing to the bottom of the lake. The sail hung loose in the water, folding over, wrapping itself around Rodin. His lungs burned and his stomach contracted. He needed air. Conscious that Leopold had slipped from his grasp, Rodin clawed at the canvas, pushing it aside. He kicked, then clawed his way up, to where the blackness wasn't quite as intense. Light burst into his vision, his stomach clenched again, and nausea rose. His head broke the surface. He gulped down air, thought he'd throw up. He coughed and threw his arms out, splashing in the water. It sparkled in the light. The bright light that played over the surface of the lake. As the roar of the water in his ears subsided, Rodin heard the soft purr of an engine close by. There was a voice too, asking if he was okay. He spun, but hands reached under his arms and someone grunted as the water fell away from him. No, as he was pulled free of the lake.
Can you see me? Can you tell me your name?
The voice was female. Rodin blinked, patches of light dispersing in his vision, and he saw a head partially concealed by long hair. The woman appeared to be leaning over him. What happened? He stammered. Who was this woman, and what was she doing on the water? He'd been alone with the counselor, hadn't he? No lights, no sounds from this other boat that he now lay in. Leopold, he said, not sure exactly what he was asking.
Relax.
A hand brushed his head.
Look.
She reached one arm round him, tilting his whole body so that he could look out onto the water. The dark shape floating close by was surely the upturned hull of Leopold's Guinevere, but there was a figure in the water just to one side. No, two figures. One lay flat in the water, and the other pulled them both toward the woman's vessel. She reached over, grabbing the floating person. As she lay him in the boat, Rodin recognized the prone figure as Leopold. He wasn't moving, and his eyes were closed, and for a moment Rodin thought that maybe his plan had worked. But there was no urgency in the woman, or the man who now climbed up beside Leopold. The woman bent over the counselor, her back to Rodin.
He's unconscious, but he's alive,
she said. Blood flowed from Leopold's head, but the woman pressed a bandage down. The bandage soon lost its whiteness, and she placed another over the top, sealing it in place with tape. She rested Leopold on his side, and Rodin could see the rhythmic rise and fall of the man's chest. Damn.
Always said these nighttime sessions were a risk.
The woman said, like she was chastising a child.
But he wouldn't listen.
He might pay more heed now.
The man rubbed his head, droplets of water flying.
Maybe. Still don't reckon he'll be happy we were watching, though.
The man shrugged, then turned to Rodin and knelt down.
How are you doing? Any injuries? Any pain?
Rodin shook his head. The pain was all internal. He'd failed.
Okay. We'll get you back to the clubhouse.
The man turned to the woman.
You've called for help?
Should be here in a few minutes,
she said, and turned to Rodin, the bright light once more obscuring her features.
We'll get our friend here to the Medicenter, and they can give him a full check. But from what I can tell, there's no injuries that won't heal in time. Might have a nasty bump on his head for a while, and he'll have to rest up for a few days, but he had a lucky escape.
But there was a sharpness to her voice that felt out of place. Like she was blaming Rodin. He shuddered, and it might have been from the cold, but it might have been from the growing realization. The woman glared at him, he knew this, even though her face was in shadow. She did blame him. And what she'd said earlier, she was watching over the counselor, even on his supposed private nighttime sales. Like she was protecting him. Rodin thought of the ambush by that stinking river in the districts, and of the assassin sent to ensure he didn't take this contract. Kat had spoken of those who wanted to ensure Leopold remained alive. They'd come after him before he crossed the glass. And there was no reason they'd stop protecting Leopold now. Far from it. With Rodin so close to the counselor, they'd only increase their efforts to ensure he failed.